Hey guys, tonight we are stepping back into the dirt-floored huts and smoky hearths of medieval peasant life, where families did not rely on grocery markets or dietary supplements but on barley porridge, wilted greens, and whatever game or fish they could catch. Forget the royal banquets and opulent feasts you see in glossy histories. The real story is about stale bread, watery stew, and the desperate scramble for a crust of cheese. So tonight we ask, what did a medieval peasant actually eat from dawn to dusk and more? What did it taste like to survive on roots, grains, and the odd salted fish in a season of scarcity? Every region had its own fare, so let me know where you are tuning in from and what time it is where you are. It is always fascinating to see whose land we tread through the fields of history. Now dim the lights, pull your blanket close, and let us chew on those humble meals together. You wake before first light, long before roosters stir. The air feels sharp against your lungs as you rise from a pallet of straw and furs that never truly warm. Outside the thin walls of your hut, the world remains silent. A single sliver of grey shows where the sky will brighten soon. You steady yourself against the rough timber post and draw a breath. The scent of last night's embers still lingers in the corner where a clay pot cools on cold stones. Today you begin with barley. You scoop handfuls of the coarse grain from a woven sack. Each seed feels like a small stone beneath your fingers. You ladle cool water from the well and pour it over the barley into your oldest cooking pot. The metal feels cold against your palm. You set the pot on a tripod of stones around last night's embers. Sparks rise as you press dry twigs beneath the pot's belly. You fan the flame with a piece of cloth until the fire glows gold. Steam begins to curl from the pot's rim. By the time dawn light filters through the roof cracks, the barley has softened into a pale slurry. You stir with a wooden spoon carved smooth by years of use. Each stir scrapes the grain from the pot's bottom, revealing the bare blackened ring where heat scorched last week's mix. You dip a finger and taste the gruel. It carries the faint tang of old ash and the dull whisper of cold water. Hunger gnaws at your belly, yet you must wait until the porridge thickens, lest you swallow half-raw grains that would stick like lead. As the sun yawn begins outside, you fetch a bowl fashioned from split wood. Its edges bear grooves from countless meals. You dip the spoon and lift the first ladle into the bowl. The porridge glides slowly, leaving a thin trail. You carry the bowl to the smoke-stained corner, where your family gathers. The ember pit still glows faintly. Your children huddle around the hearthstones, rubbing frozen hands together. They watch as you set each bowl before them. Their eyes gleam with silent gratitude. There is no spoon for sharing. Each must eat from their own hollowed wood. You return to the pot for your own portion. By now, the porridge has thickened to barely more than paste. You lift the wooden spoon and blow across its surface, chasing steam into the air. Then you tilt your head back and swallow the first mouthful. The grain slides down warm but gritty. Each chew releases more grit than flavor. Yet this thin, rice-colored mash feeds your hunger enough to rise. You scoop another mouthful and follow it with water poured from a small leather flask. The water stings when cold. It cuts the grain paste as it flows. Across the smoke-cracked floor, your neighbor's wife shuffles forward. She brings over a handful of wilted kale gathered from last autumn's patch. You drop the greens into the bubbling porridge pot and stir. The leaves turn lifeless green as they soften. You know this addition adds not much flavor yet, brings a faint vitamin trace. You scrape a little of the enhanced gruel into your neighbor's bowl. She offers a nod and lifts the bowl to warm her hands. She takes a single bite and closes her eyes against the bitterness. Today this is fine fare. When your children finish, you find a few grains of barley stuck in the wooden grooves of their bowls. You rub the inside with clean cloth and flick the remnants into the fire pit. You gather the empty bowls and place them beside the door to dry against the rising sun. Soon their thirst will turn to appetite again. You kneel and pour fresh water onto the hearthstones to coax steam for washing your hands. The liquid hisses and sputters. You press your palms against the warmth and rub the ash into the grain paste that clings beneath your nails. Each scrub brings relief. Outside, the first birds call across misty fields. You pause at the threshold, adjusting your coarse tunic around your shoulders. Today you must leave soon for the fields, but for this moment you savor the lingering heat in your belly. The morning porridge and the ritual of stirring, tasting, ladling and sharing has given you strength. You step beyond the door into the cold dawn. You raise your face to the pale sun. Your gut feels steady. You are ready to meet the labor ahead. And in this simple dawn ritual, you honor the ancient promise that food, no matter how humble, can fuel survival. You wipe the last scrap of gruel from your lips and rise from your low stool. Outside the hut, you saw the baker's smoke curling up above the clay oven. It is time for your second ritual of morning sustenance, breaking coarse bread and sipping thin broth to bolster you for the day's work. You step across the threshold onto packed earth and follow the scented trail of smoke. The baker, an older man with flower-white hair and stained tunic, lifts the oven door with a long wooden peel. He rakes embers aside and reveals loaves of dark rye bread, their cracked crusts dusted in ash. He points to 4 small round loaves set on a plank. Each loaf weighs no more than a child's fist, but contains more substance than a bowl of barley gruel. He slices one loaf in half, the blade rasping through dense crumb. The interior is heavy and dotted with tiny air pockets. You take a half loaf and cradle it in both hands, feeling its weight and warmth. You bring it to your lips and bite. The crust shatters beneath your teeth. Inside, the bread is chewy and firm. It tastes of grain and smoke and yesterday's memories. Chewing slowly, you savor the few crumbs that fall onto your tunic and scrape them back into your mouth. They are too valuable to lose. You swallow and feel the bread settle in your stomach like small stones that will keep hunger at bay until midday. Next, you lift a wooden mug from the baker's counter. He has ladled a thin vegetable broth from his cauldron. The broth is pale amber and filled with scant strips of carrot and leeks that survived last autumn's frost. You bring the mug to your nose. A wisp of steam rises and carries the faint sweetness of root vegetables. You sip and let the broth slide down your throat. It warms your insides and slides easily across the bread, lingering in your belly. A neighbor woman passes by, carrying 2 loaves in a woven basket. She nods at you and snaps a piece of bread from her own loaf. She hands it over with a small smile. You accept and pass her a sip of your broth. Neither of you says a word because no words are needed. The exchange is kindness enough before the chores of the day swallow all thought of comfort. With bread half eaten and broth drained, you return the mug to the baker. He fills it again from the simmering pot with a hollowed gourd ladle. You thank him with a nod and step back toward your hut. The sun has risen higher now, turning grey sky to pale gold. It will not be warm for hours, but the day has begun. Inside your hut, you place the remaining half loaf on a board by the door, so it will dry slightly and resist mold. You inspect your wooden spoon and bowl, rubbing away stray bits of porridge and broth. Each tool must last through weeks of use. You carry them outside to rinse at the well and hang them on a peg above the door. Beyond the cooking area, you fetch your bucket and head to the barn. Your morning rituals extend to your few animals. You lift the latch on the stall door and enter. The lowing of your cow greets you. You set the bucket on the ground and sink onto a small stool. You run your hands along the cow's flanks, feeling coarse hair and steady warmth beneath. You grip an udder and draw down, coaxing milk that flows into the bucket. Each squeeze yields a small stream of white. You collect enough for your family's breakfast tomorrow, when you will cook it into butter or cheese. For now, you pour a small measure into your wooden mug and swallow. The fresh milk tastes faintly sweet. It coats your throat and rounds the edges of yesterday's bitterness. As you stand with the empty bucket, you glance back at your field. The rows lie bare now after last season's harvest. Soon you will sow seeds here. Today you will clear stones and brace the soil for planting. But first you must honor the final step of your morning ritual prayer and permission. You kneel on the dew-dampened grass and fold your hands. The sky remains overcast, but you imagine the sun's rays piercing through to bless your labors. You offer thanks for the porridge, the bread, the broth, and the milk. You pray that the soil will hold seed, and that rain will fall in measured gentle showers. You ask only for the strength to endure hunger and ease the ache of calloused hands. Your voice is low and steady. Other neighbors pause in their own ritualsome at well pumps, others before barn doors. You commune silently under a shared sky. Rising, you wipe your eyes on the sleeve of your tunic. A thin wind stirs at your back. You pull on your woolen hood and shoulders settle with the weight of your day's work. In your belt pouch you carry a small crust of bread saved from this morning's half loaf. It will keep your energy when porridge seems too far away. You dip the crust in your empty mug, scraping the last drops of broth from the sides. Each crumb sustains you. Before you leave the village green, you stop at the smith's stall. The blacksmith hammers the final sparks from a horseshoe and nods at you. He offers you a small scrap of leftover rye bread. You accept and fold it into your pouch. The gesture feels like a blessing from the workshop. You return the nod and continue along the rutted cart track toward your field. Along the way, you pass women gathering nettle seeds for soup thickening and children chasing chickens from the road's edge. Each carries bits of morning sustenance. Some hold clumps of barley in their fists, nibbling as they run. Others carry skins of water to drink when the sun climbs higher and thirst gnaws. You wave at an old man leaning on his wooden staff. He offers you a crust steeped in ale from last night's brew. You tap the crust on your pouch and move on. By the time you reach your field, your body has settled into the rhythm of dawn. Hunger feels distant for now. You kneel and clear away weeds and clods of earth. You test each handful of soil, breaking it with your fingers. The ground feels cool and moist beneath the surface. You place a handful of barley grains into the furrow, recalling this morning's ritual of porridge. Each seed is a promise that your labor will feed you once again when dark returns, and so your morning sustenance ends. The porridge gave you warmth. The bread and broth gave you substance. The milk gave you renewal. The prayer gave you hope. Now you rise to meet the sun and turn toward the fields, ready to plant, to toil, and to endure. In these simple meals, you find the strength to survive another day. You step into the smoky warmth of the village bakehouse before sunrise. The air is thick with the scent of sap driftwood and stone warmed by last night's embers. Inside, a long clay oven stands built into the far wall. Its mouth yawns like a hungry beast, glowing faint amber from the coals that smolder within. A baker in a soot-stained tunic lifts the oven door with a wooden paddle and rakes embers aside with a hooked iron bar. Sparks drift upward and settle on the low ceiling, then fade in the gloom above. You watch as he pulls out a row of loaves, each shaped from coarse rye dough left to rise overnight in wicker baskets. He sets the loaves on a large plank of oak and slaps them gently to knock away the ash. The crust feels firm yet springy beneath his calloused hands. He sets the plank aside and begins another batch. With water and spent flour, he kneads a dark lump of new dough until it feels smooth and pliable. He pats it into round loaves and dusts, each with fine meal from the last grinding of wheat. You run a finger along the edge of a loaf and taste the bare starch. It clings lightly to your skin, promising more substance than porridge alone. Outside the bakehouse door, you wait with a small wooden bowl in hand. Each villager arrives in turn to claim a loaf or two. Today you share one with a neighbor whose children beg for more. You break the loaf in half before you reach the table next to the hearth. The bread's crust shatters beneath your thumb, and crumbs tumble to the floor in a soft rain. You catch each fragment with your palm and raise it to your lips. The interior crumb feels dense and chewy. It carries the faint sweetness of grain warmed by the night and the bitter tang of natural leaven. Across the room, your friend pastes a handful of chopped leek and carrot into a boiling pot of water. He stirs the pale broth with a spoon carved from boxwood, scraping at the edges where simmering breaks the surface tension. Drops of fat float in rippling circles. The broth is thin and clear, yet fragrant with morning harvest. You lean forward and inhale. The steam brushes your face and carries the earthiness of root vegetables. You close your eyes and breathe deeply as though the scent itself could fill your empty belly. You place 1/2 loaf on a wooden board and tear off small pieces. Each piece arrives in your mouth warm and soft. The crust flutters under your tongue. You chew slowly, letting the bread absorb your saliva before you swallow. Your neighbor passes you the wooden spoon from the broth pot and nods. You dip it into the simmering liquid and lift a small amber spoonful. You wait for a moment before you bring it to your lips. The broth slides down smooth and leaves the faint bite of onion and carrot. You follow with a piece of bread to weigh it in your stomach. When you finish the first spoonful, you gesture for more. You ladle again and fill the bowl nearly half full. Your neighbor smiles at your appetite and tilts the ladle further so the broth flows easily. Tiny shreds of carrot and leek float on the surface. You wonder how these thin slivers once grew in the damp garden behind your hut. Now they nourish you more surely than any feast could. You sip and chew until only the broth remains in your bowl. You pause and let your breathing steady, feeling warmth settle in your chest. A child tugs at your sleeve, begging for a crust to carry away. You break off a small piece and hand it to her. She pops it into her mouth and chews in silence. Her eyes glint with delight at the soft crumb. You pat her shoulder and rise to return the empty bowl. The baker nods approval when you place the bowl on the counter. He wipes his hands and tosses the stale bits into the fire pit to feed the coals. The flames hiss and sputter under the next batch of heats. Outside the bakehouse, you pause in the pale light of dawn. The sky has shifted from grey to a wash of pale gold. You cradle the other half of your loaf in the crook of your arm. You wrap the crust in a clean cloth and tie it to your belt. It must last until midday, when you can break it with cheese or dip it again in broth. You fetch a small pot from your home and carry it to the village well. You fill it with fresh water and carry it back toward your hut. As you walk, you break off a corner of bread and dip it into the pot's rim. The crust soaks up the cold water and swells slightly. You bite again and taste the mingling of grain and water. It feels like more than substance. It feels like a promise of strength to come. Behind you, other villagers carry loaves and mugs of broth back to their own homes. There is solidarity in this simple fare. Each morning's ritual binds you to neighbors whose names you may forget but whose presence sustains you. By the time you reach home, the second ritual of the morning is complete. The bread and broth have formed a bolstering pair. One gives weight and chew, the other washes down each bite and settles warmth in your core. You set the loaf on a shelf and the empty pot by the hearth. You kneel before the fire and knead your stiff fingers in its heat. Soon you will head to the fields to till, sow, or harvest. The day will stretch long, and your back will arc with labor. But for now you savor the lingering warmth in your belly. You rise and pick up your work tools, a sharp hoe in your right hand, and a small basket in your left. You step onto the cold earth outside your hut. The river beyond glints silver in morning light. Your breath forms small clouds as you make your way toward the tilled rows. Your steps feel surer than yesterday. The first bread and broth have fortified you against hunger and cold. They have reminded you why you endure. Each dawn's baking and simmering brings more than sustenance. It brings the quiet resolve to meet the day's toil, to plant hope, and to carry on through the ebb and flow of harvest and scarcity alike. You step back through your hut's low doorway, carrying the loaf and the wooden bowl still faintly warm from broth. Inside, the walls smell of smoke and damp thatch. Your children stir on their rough pallets of straw, blinking against the soft dawn light. You set the loaf on a flat stone beside the hearth and place the bowl on a small bench. Your eldest daughter crawls forward and lifts the bowl to her lips. She sips in tiny gulps, the warm broth sliding down her throat. You hand her a torn piece of crust to dip into the amber liquid. She savors each bite, her cheeks rosy with hunger. Your son sits nearby, holding half the loaf in both hands. He breaks off chunks with his teeth and lets the crumbs fall onto his lap. He never looks at them, though. He chews with a solemn expression, as if each morsel carries weight. You watch him finish the last crumb and place the crust beside his bowl. He straightens and tucks his shirt beneath his tunic to wipe stray bits from his chin. You return to the hearth and rake a handful of embers aside. The small heap still glows with warmth. You fetch a fresh stick of kindling and coax flame beneath a second pot that hangs on an iron hook. Into that you pour cold water drawn just moments ago from the well. You add a few broken bits of bread crust left over from yesterday. As the water warms, you stir it with a handful of chopped cabbage and carrot strips. You let the thin broth bubble gently, intending it for midday. Across the hut, your neighbor's wife enters, carrying a small basket. She lays a handful of dried peas and lentils on the earthen floor. Together, you sort the split pulses, discarding any shriveled or darkened bits. Each good seed goes into a clay jar that you will seal and store beside your bed. The rest become tomorrow's gruel. You pass her a wooden spoon to guide her work, and she smiles in thanks. This simple sharing of food and labor weaves community around every hearth. The broth simmers quietly now. You kneel beside it and taste the sliver of cabbage. It has softened just enough to yield a faint sweetness. You add a pinch of salt carried from last summer's store. The crystals hiss as they strike the water, releasing a faint steam that moves across your face. You stand and wipe your palms on your tunic. You place the clay jar of pulses on a low shelf and turn back to the loaf. The second half still looks firm and awaits its fate. You slice it into 4 roughly equal pieces with your carving knife, each piece meant for your family, and perhaps one for a passing traveler. You wrap each slice in a strip of linen cloth to keep it soft and free from flies. You tuck the parcels into your pouch at your waist. Outside the hut, a thin mist hangs over the ground. You stoop to tie your leather boots. The fit has loosened with wear, but still holds your foot snug. You lift your gaze to the roof tiles overhead and spot a few loose thatch straws. You reach up and press each stray piece back into the bundle. Keeping the roof tight prevents rain and wind from invading your home when winter returns. Your daughter follows you at your heels. She sports a small cloth pouch she inherited from her grandfather. She opens it and offers you a handful of crushed barley grains. She claims she gathered them yesterday by the barn. You take the grains and admire her stubborn hope. You promise her that tonight she will cook them into a thicker porridge by lantern light. You swing your tools across your shoulder and step into the chill morning air. The sun has risen a little higher, turning the mist to pale gold. You hear roosters crowing from nearby farms. Chickens scratch in the dirt beside fenced yards. A cow in the neighbor's pen lows softly, awaiting her morning grain. You pause and lift a piece of wrapped bread from your pouch. You break off a small corner and hand it to your daughter. She tucks it into her mouth and grins. You smile in return, heart lighter for her joy. You both set off down the narrow path toward the fields. At the edge of the village, you pass the smith's workshop. The forge's heat spills out from beneath closed shutters. You lift a hand in greeting, and the blacksmith nods from his workbench inside. Today he will shoe the oxen that pull the plow. You pause to watch him hammer, the rhythmic clang reverberating through the air. Sparks drift like tiny fireflies and settle on the ground. Even at this distance, you feel the fire's warmth. Further on, you meet a traveling merchant carrying bolts of cloth tied across his back. He fates you a crust of bread from his own bundle, and you offer him a sip of the steaming broth cooled in your bowl. He accepts with quiet gratitude. He says his journey to the next town will be long, and that this simple meal reminds him of home. You wish him safe travels, and continue on your way. By the time you reach the field, the morning light fully bathes the land. You place your tools on a split stump and rest your shoulders. You draw from your pouch a wooden mug filled with the cabbage broth brewed earlier. You sip and feel the warmth spread from your chest to your fingertips. You nudge the stump's edge with your boot and rest for a moment, savoring the hush before labor. Your children scamper ahead to help with weeding. You watch as they slip between furrows, hands busy at the soil. The bread they carry tied in cloth sways against their backs. You know they will snack when hunger returns. You too will rely on the second bread and the broth before the sun reaches its peak. You touch the furrowed earth with your fingertips. The soil crumbles softly like loamy bread beneath your hands. You root out stubborn weeds and toss them to the side. You place each pulled weed in a pile and clear the row for sowing. Here you will plant more lentils and peas that will nourish you again come harvest. Each seed sown today owes gratitude to the breakfast breads and broth that gave you life this morning. A breeze stirs and carries the scent of wildflowers from a nearby field. You pause to close your eyes and breathe deeply. The fragrance mingles with the memory of baked rye and simmered cabbage. It reminds you of cycles beyond hunger and toil. The day ahead will be long and your back will ache. Yet in these simple morning rituals are you bound to the land and to those who share it. The breads and broth have linked your body to your labor and your spirit to your kin. With renewed resolve, you rise and shoulder your hoe. The field awaits its first furrow. The day begins in earnest. Yet every few strokes you glance at your children, breaking bread from cloth wrappings and smiling at one another as they sip their broth. You share that smile, knowing that breakfast, breads, and broth are far more than mere food. They are the quiet bonds that hold your life together from dawn to dusk and beyond. You rise before dawn once more and follow the worn path to the edge of your family's grain field. A pale mist drifts between rows of silver-tipped oats and dark rye stalks. You carry your wooden sickle in one hand and a woven basket in the other. The air smells of damp earth and early morning dew. You step carefully between the rows, mindful of the heavy heads of grain that bow low under their own weight. You pause at the first patch of oats. You sweep the sickle in a curved motion, severing a handful of stalks at their base. Each cut sends a scatter of seeds spilling to the ground. You grasp the bundle of stalks and drop them into the basket. You repeat this motion until the basket fills with stalks that rustle like distant seas in your hands. You can feel the gentle swish of each sweep, mixed with the sharp tug of the stalk as it parts from the soil. Once the basket is full of oats, you carry it to the field's edge and tie the stalks into a sheaf. You use a bit of twisted grass as a ribbon. The sheaf stands upright against the breeze. Soon you and your kin will gather sheaves into shocks that will dry in the sun. Each shock will hold enough grain to grind into flour for weeks of bread and porridge. You return to the field, this time moving to the rye patch. The rye stalks stand taller and stiffer than oats. Their heads curve with heavy seeds that blast like small hail when they fall. You bend at the waist and sweep the sickle through the stalks. At first, your back protests, but you steady your breathing and lengthen each cut. The basket fills faster here because each rye stalk carries more grain. Mid-morning sun filters through the mist and warms your shoulders. You pause to wipe sweat from your brow and dip your hands into a water skin carried at your hip. The cool water revives you. You look over rows of cropped stalks and already imagine the next meal. Soon these grains will become meal to sustain you until the next harvest. When your basket is full of rye, you carry it back to the shock area. You bind the stalks in thick bundles and arrange them upright in the next ring around the first shock. Each shock forms a small silo of drying grain. You step back and admire the neat row of bundles, their golden tops catching sunlight like flames. By noon, your hands bear blisters from the rough stalks and the weighted handle of the sickle. Hunger gnaws at your belly. You break open a small cloth bundle at your waist and retrieve a piece of yesterday's flatbread. You nibble at the crust until the last crumb vanishes. You wash it down with a sip of cool water. Only then do you return to the field. As afternoon light wanes, you complete harvesting the final stretch of oats and rye. The sun dips lower, painting the sky in bands of rose and lavender. You stand in the field, surveying the cleared rows. The stalks lie cut, but countless heads remain in the shocks to dry. Your work today will feed your family for months to come. You gather your tools and return home with woven baskets now empty of stalks but heavy with pride. At the hut, you set each basket beside the granary door. You fetch a small wooden shovel and scoop the dried grains from the shocks into the baskets. You lift each handful and drop it through a winnowing basket, tossing the grain into the air. A breeze carries away the chaff, leaving only smooth kernels to fall back into the basket. When all the grain is winnowed, you carry the baskets to the threshing floor. It is a flat stone courtyard outside the grain storehouse. You and your neighbors gather in a circle. Each takes a handful of seed and begins to beat it with a flail carved from ash wood. You lift the flail and swing it downward, crushing grain heads against the stone. You repeat this motion until you feel the seeds released and the stalks reduced to straw. You pause to catch your breath and sweep the straw aside with a flat wooden board. What remains glitters in the slanted light oats and rye freed from their husks. You scoop the pile into a basket and carry it to the grinding stone at the far corner of the yard. The grinding stone is a simple contraption, 2 round stones stacked one atop the other. The top stone has a handle and a shallow depression at its center. You pour a handful of grain into the hole. You grip the handle and push it in a circular motion. The grain moves beneath the stones and crushes into flour. White dust clouds your hands and drifts in the sunlight. You continue grinding until the basket empties into a cloth at the stone's base. Your family joins you at the grinding stone. Your daughter takes the handle next, her small arms straining with each turn. Your son brings more grain from the storehouse. Together you mound flour to dry on a wooden board. By evening, the flour will feel light and ready for tomorrow's baking. You scoop the dried flour into a clay jar and seal it. This jar will join others storing wheat and barley for the months ahead. You wipe sweat from your brow and step back to admire the jars lined neatly on a low shelf beside the hearth. As dusk falls, you light a small lamp of tallow and sit beside the hearth. You scoop a bit of flour into a pot of water, stirring until it forms a thin porridge. You ladle the dim gruel into bowls and pass them to your family. The meal is simple, yet carries the labor of your day. Each scoop is thick with the flavor of field sun and neighbor help. You lean back and feel the porridge settle warmly in your belly. You watch as your children finish slowly, savoring each spoonful of the daily staple born of oats and rye. The dull taste of grain warms you as your body winds down from the harvest. Tomorrow, you will turn the flour into firmer bread, and these fields will await the next cycle of sowing. Before bed, you fill a leather pouch with extra flour and hang it above the hearth. The flour will keep dry and safe from mice. You whisper a prayer of thanks for the bounty of grain and the strength to harvest and grind it. Outside, the moon rises over the sleeping fields, each shock of grain standing tall against autumn wind. You settle onto your straw pallet and draw your blanket close. Hunger does not visit you tonight. Your body rests full of oats and rye transformed by your own hands. The daily staples of harvest and grinding have woven their promise into your dream. When dawn treads across the fields again, you will awaken and repeat these simple labors. In the hush before sleep, you feel the pulse of earth beneath your home, and the steady rhythm of grain turning to flour meal by meal, day after day, sustaining life through seasons of plenty and want alike. You wipe flour dust from your palms and step back from the grinding stone. The jars of freshly milled flour line the low shelf beside the hearth. Their lids fit snugly to keep out mice and moisture. Now you turn to the daily staples that will sustain you until the next harvest. You lift the largest jar and pour a handful of flour into a wooden bowl. You add a pinch of salt carried last season and stir in a little cold water drawn from the well. The mixture forms a stiff dough. You press it firmly with your palms, feeling the grain spring beneath your fingers. You knead until the dough feels smooth and elastic. Then you pat it into several flat rounds and set them aside to rest on a cloth beside the hearth. Near the hearth, a small iron pot simmers with water and a few dried peas left over from last winter. You stir the pot with a wooden spoon. The peas soften and begin to swell, releasing faint sweetness into the water. You scoop a small ladleful into a bowl and taste. The liquid carries a gentle pulse of flavor and a hint of salt. You set the broth aside to cool. You step outside to pound dry grains into coarse meal for a simple porridge. You fetch a flat stone slab and a rounded stone pestle. You scatter a handful of oats across the slab and press down with the pestle. The grains crack beneath the weight until they form a rough meal. You scoop the meal into the simmering pot of peas and water. You stir gently as the mixture bubbles and thickens into a thin gruel. The aroma drifts through the hut. It smells of grain and hearth smoke. Your youngest daughter tugs at your sleeve. She holds a wooden bowl carved with simple lines. You spoon the gruel into her bowl. She blows on the surface and sips. Her eyes brighten as warmth spreads through her. You break a small round of the rested dough and hand it to her. She dips it into the gruel and chews happily. You return to the hearth and stoke the coals beneath the baking flat rounds. You press each one onto a hot stone hearth plate. The dough bubbles and browns at the edges. You flip each round with a small spatula when the underside shows golden spots. You slide the flapjacks onto a board as they finish. Their crusts crackle softly. The house fills with the scent of warm bread. You break a warm round in half and dip it into the remaining brothy peas. You taste the meal together. The bread soaks up the liquid and your belly settles. You scoop the last spoonful of gruel into your mouth. It slides down smooth. You wipe your chin on your sleeve and smile at your family gathered around the hearth. Each holds a half round. They eat in quiet contentment. Once the meal ends, you scrape empty bowls and plates into a trough by the door. You fill a pot with cold water and rinse each piece clean. You hang them on hooks to dry in the sun's warmth. You sweep stray flour and meal from the floor with a rough broom made of bundled twigs. The hearth's coals still glow faintly. You gather the ashes in a small shovel and scatter them outside to enrich a patch of poor soil. Now you turn to storing the remaining flour and meal. You sift it once more through a straw sieve to remove any coarse bits or husks. A fine white cloud drifts into the air. You catch it on your tongue. It has a sweet grain taste, raw and alive. You scoop the sifted flour into a fresh jar and seal it. You label the jar by scratching the date into the clay lid with a small flint. You set it in a corner of the granary, where the cool air will keep it fresh. The rest of the meal from the slab you pour into another jar. This jar you place on a lower shelf, where you can reach it each morning for porridge. You cover each jar with a cloth before replacing the lid. You tie the cloth with a bit of braided grass. That will catch any stray bugs before you lift the lid at dawn. Outside, you step into the garden plot beside your hut. You kneel and plant small mounds of grain seeds reserved for the next field. You press each seed into moist soil and cover it gently. You water the rows with a small clay pot. Watching the first green shoots will sustain your hope through the lean months ahead. As midday approaches, you return to the granary. You lift a leather pouch containing dried fruit and nuts traded at market. You pull out a handful of crushed walnuts and sprinkle them into a bowl of thick porridge made from yesterday's stored meal. You sip this richer porridge and nibble on bits of dried berry. The flavors balance, and you feel stronger than before. You carry the bowl to the field edge, where your eldest son waits. He has been weeding between the new plantings. He kneels to eat and props the bowl beside his boot. He picks at the nut specks and chews thoughtfully. You rest on the handle of your hoe and watch the breeze ripple through the green sprouts. Later, you return home for another round of staples. You light a lamp of tallow as dusk settles. You dust off a wooden board and scoop out a small pile of stored flour. You add water and knead the dough, repeating the morning ritual. You pat the rounds thin and bake them on the hearthstone. You stir a pot of thin broth made from dried herbs and leftover vegetables. You ladle the broth into bowls and pass them around. You break the rounds into pieces and dip them in the hot liquid. Each bite warms you against the gathering chill. Your children lean toward the fire, their cheeks glowing in the lamplight. The daily staples of grain and broth sustain both body and spirit. They remind you that simple foods can give strength through seasons of want. After the evening meal, you gather the last jars of flour and meal. You seal them tight and tuck them under the eaves of the hut. The cool night air will keep them dry. You whisper a wish for rest and renewal. You thank the grains for the cycle they complete, from field to shock to grindstone to jar to pot to hearth and finally to your belly. You settle onto your straw pallet and draw the quilt close. Outside, the wind murmurs through the thatch. Within, you feel the soft weight of grain's promise. Tomorrow you will rise again to sow, harvest, and grind anew. You will eat the daily staples baked and stirred by your own hands. You will labor under sun and rain. Yet each meal will sustain you until the next dawn breaks, and you repeat the cycle of field grains and daily staples. You step from the village lane into a narrow path flanked by tangled hedgerows. The dawn mist still clings to the low branches, and dew glistens on leaves like scattered pearls. You carry a small woven basket and a sharp knife tucked into your belt. Today you leave behind your plow and sickle to harvest the wild greens and berries that hide at the forest edge. You pause before the first stand of brambles. Thorny canes twist together in a tangle of brittle brown stems. You push aside the outer branches and see small shriveled fruits clinging to the inner thicket. These are the last brambles of autumn. Their skins have turned dark and wrinkled, but taste sweet beneath the sharp tang of frost. You slip your hand into the briar and pinch a berry between thumb and forefinger. You roll it gently until it gives beneath your touch, then pop it into your mouth. A burst of sweet juice warms your tongue and prompts a small smile. You place a half-dozen blackened brambles into your basket, careful not to catch your fingers on the thorns. You cut away a few broken canes that snag your clothes, then move deeper into the hedgerow toward a stand of nettles. The stalks rise tall beside a ditch that channels rainwater from the fields. You don thin gloves and bend to gather young leaves from the top third of each plant. You pinch the stems and strip away the tender leaves. You know these bitter greens will wilt into a palatable salad or stew when boiled. You collect enough for 2 families, shaking off stray insects as you go. Beyond the nettles, you find a patch of dandelion. The jagged leaves cluster close to the ground, dark green and sturdy. You tug at the base and pull up the entire root. You shake away clinging soil and slice off the yellow flowers with your knife. The roots will make a bitter tea to ease winter chills. You drop each root into your basket before gathering a handful of leaves. You taste a raw leaf and wince at the sharp bitterness. You remind yourself that this bitterness will clear the blood when mixed with a little broth. You pause at a rotting log where moss and fallen leaves form a soft carpet. Beneath you see young sorrel plants with arrow-shaped leaves. Their tart flavor will brighten any meal of gruel or porridge. You pluck each leaf carefully and inspect it for beetles or grit. When your basket holds enough, you step away to avoid trampling new growth. A breeze stirs and carries the sound of distant church bells. Your children might be at the well drawing water for today's chores. You imagine their small faces when you bring home these wild finds. You hope they will taste the berries and laugh at their sweetness. You edge toward a sunlit gap in the hedgerow. There you find a few last gooseberries clinging to thorny branches. The fruits are small and pale green, striped with faint lines. You slice them from the branch with your knife and place them in your basket. Each gooseberry offers a sharp tang that will lift the flavor of watery broth. You taste one and feel its sour sting transform into a gentle sweetness as you chew. Moving on, you spy a stand of ivy-leaved toadflax. The delicate yellow flowers droop like small lanterns. You know these blooms are poisonous if eaten raw, yet when dried and ground they become a gentle remedy for sore throats. You twist a few stems free and tie them in a bundle with a strip of linen. You drop the bundle into your pouch to hang by the hearth. You bend again to the ground where you glimpse a patch of chickweed. The tiny, pointed leaves grow in mat-like clusters and yield easily to your fingers. You pinch handfuls of green threads and lift them into the basket. Chickweed brings no bitterness and tastes clean when eaten fresh. It will brighten a bowl of gruel or stew. You continue along the hedgerow until you reach a moss-covered stone wall. Behind it lies a stand of wild mustard. The broad leaves taste peppery and bold. You slice away a few leaves and fold them carefully so they will not bruise. You taste the mustard leaf against your tongue and feel its sharp heat slide down your throat. You smile at its strength and imagine adding it to tomorrow's broth. You pause at a hollow where a small birch seedling grows. Its young leaves are tender and pale. You break off a few sprigs and sniff them gently. A faint scent of tea and fresh sap drifts upward. You tuck the sprigs into your basket to steep later. As you move on, you notice clusters of wood sorrel beneath an oak. The leaves form tiny hearts and smell faintly of lemon. You pluck a cluster and pop a leaf into your mouth. The tartness enlivens you. You gather more, careful to leave plenty behind for wildlife. Your basket now brims with a motley collection of greens and berries. You stand and stretch your back. The sun rises higher and dries the mist from the hedgerows. You wipe your brow and survey the path home. Your knees ache from bending, but your spirit feels light. You follow the worn track back toward the village. Along the way, you pass a neighbor carrying a bundle of firewood. You greet her and show her your basket. She nods approval and offers a small piece of last night's smoked fish in exchange for a handful of nettle leaves. You accept her trade and tuck the fish into your pouch. By the edge of the village, you halt before the duck pond. The water shimmers beneath the rising sun. You gather a handful of watercress that thrives in the clear stream outlet. Each leaf is crisp and cool. You rinse them quickly under a spigot and add them to your collection. The watercress will spice a bowl of porridge or toss into fresh salad. At your hut, you step inside and place the basket on a low table. The children gather around, curious eyes wide. You unpack each treasure and name them: black brambles, nettle leaves, dandelion roots, sorrel, clot of gooseberries, chickweed, mustard leaves, birch sprouts, wood sorrel, watercress. Your daughter laughs at the bitter leaves, and your son reaches to taste a berry. You light the small hearth fire and hang a pot of water to boil. You steep the birch sprouts and toadflax in a clay jug for tomorrow's remedy. You blanch the nettle leaves in boiling water to remove sting, then plunge them into cold water. You chop them roughly and stir them into a pot of broth with diced carrots and onions from last night's supper. You add a handful of gooseberries and wood sorrel to the pot for tang and color. The air fills with a heady mix of peppery mustard, sweet berries, and savory greens. You ladle the steaming soup into bowls and pass them around. The bitter greens soften in the broth and carry hints of lemon and pepper. The berries burst in your mouth with sugary tang. The children slurp the soup and break crusts of coarse bread to dip into the liquid. As you eat, you watch the steam rise and know these foraged vines will sustain you through winter lean. Each bitter leaf and wrinkled berry carries the labor of hedge and bramble. Each morsel reminds you of seasons past and the promise of spring. You finish the last bowl and clear the table. That night, you hang the remaining greens to dry by the hearth. You tie bundles of mustard leaves, sorrel, and dandelion roots above the flames. You sprinkle the berries on a flat stone to dry slowly. You whisper thanks to the hedgerows and wild fields that feed you when plough and tilling cannot. You lay down to sleep and dream of spring's green hedges heavy with new life, knowing that your basket's humble treasures bridge hunger and hope through every season. You tuck the last bundle of dried greens into your cloth satchel and step deeper into the hedgerow where berries cling to thorned branches. You pause at a tangle of sloe bushes, their hardy shrubs heavy with small purple drupes that survived frost and drought alike. You pluck one between thumb and forefinger and roll it until it gives beneath your touch. The skin snaps and bitter juice coats your tongue. You swallow and feel a sharp bite at your throat. This astringent berry will make a fine winter cordial when steeped with honey and warming spices. You gather a handful, careful not to pierce your fingers on the hidden spines. A moment later, you round a bend and spy clusters of wild elderberries hanging beneath arching boughs. The berries are small and almost black in the dim light. You slice the clusters from the brittle stems with your knife and let them tumble into your basket. You know that elderberries make a rich syrup that eases winter colds. You will cook them down over gentle heat until the berries burst and release their deep purple hue. When strained through cloth, the liquid becomes a tonic that children sip to ward off coughs. Beyond the elder, you find a stand of hawthorn. Scarlet haws dangle like lanterns along moss-covered branches. Their skins are firm and smooth. You pierce each haw with the blade of your knife, coaxing the flesh from the core. You taste one and note the mild sweetness beneath a faint tartness. You gather enough for a pot of fruit compote. You imagine simmering them slowly with a handful of crushed rosehip seeds for added vitamin C. You push aside arching dog rose canes to reveal bright orange rosehips clustered in pairs. Each hip feels firm beneath your fingers. You twist them free and drop them into your basket. Later, you will split each hip and remove a mass of tiny hairs and seeds. You will dry the outer shells on a window ledge, where cold wind will carry away moisture. These dried rosehips will steep into a tea that tastes sharp and tangy, bright as autumn sunlight. As you continue, you come upon a low bush of bilberries. The tiny blue fruits cling close to the ground among dark green leaves. You bend and shake clusters gently, letting ripe berries fall into a shallow wooden bowl you carry in your lap. Each bilberry stains your fingers with deep indigo. You taste one and feel its subtle sweetness and earthy tang. These berries will become a thick preserve to spread on bread or mix into morning porridge. Nearby, you spot a few wild blackcurrant bushes. The glossy clusters of berries hang heavy and almost slide off their stems. You strip several bunches and tuck them into a linen cloth to preserve their shape. You recall how last winter you used black currant syrup to sweeten sour broth for the children. They clap their hands at the unexpected treat, even on the coldest days. The hedgerow ahead opens into an ancient field boundary where gnarled rowan trees stand sentinel. You climb onto a low stone wall and reach for the coral-colored rowan berries. You twist small bunches free and let them fall into your basket. Each berry feels firm and cold. You taste one and recoil at its bitter tang. Yet when stewed with wild apple slices and a bit of honey, rowan berries soften into a tart chutney, perfect for meaty stews. You step down and gather a few stray bunches of ivy berries that russulate beneath twisted vines. You know these to be poisonous if eaten raw. Instead, you plan to dry them and crush into a paste used as a binding agent in certain breads, or as a dye for cloth. You drop them into a separate pouch to keep them from mixing with the edible fruits. The sun has climbed higher now, and dries the mist from the leaves. Your basket brims with sloe berries, elderberries, haws, rose hips, bilberries, black currants, rowan berries, and a handful of ivy berries for dye. You wipe sweat from your brow and pause to rest against the old stone wall. The cool surface steadies you as you catch your breath. You dip a bilberry into your mouth and feel its gentle juice coat your tongue. Hunger pulses again, and you break a small piece of dried bread crust to wash down the tart sweetness. Refreshed, you refill your basket to its full capacity. You wrap the ivy berries in a scrap of cloth and tie them tight. You loop rose hips in a second pouch. The rest of the fruits you leave loose to rest gently in their woven cradle. You lift the basket and turn toward the hedgerow entrance. At the edge of the village, you meet the elder gathered to prepare a healing salve. She inspects your harvest and nods approval. She takes half your rose hips and half your elderberries in exchange for a small flask of earlier made cordial. You accept and tuck the cordial into your belt pouch. Its sweet aroma lifts your spirits. By your own hut, you unload your spoils on a wooden table beside the hearth. You fetch a clay pot and pour the elderberries and rose hips inside. You add water and a handful of wild maple sugar saved from last spring's sap. You stir until the sugar dissolves and the berries float. You set the pot on the hearth to simmer gently. The air fills with the scent of stewed berries and warming spice. Next, you prepare sloe cordial. You crush the sloes with a wooden pestle against the bottom of a glazed bowl. You stir in a little vinegar to draw out flavor and heartbreak the astringency. You cover the mixture and let it stand overnight. In the morning, you will strain the liquid and sweeten it into a potent elixir that fights winter chill and fevers. Your bilberries become a simple preserve. You tip them into a shallow pan and add a little water and sweetener. You simmer until the berries collapse and the mixture thickens into a spreadable jam. You transfer it to small jars and seal them under cloth covers. Each jar carries the taste of summer's fields, preserved against long winter nights. You ventilate the ivy berries in a separate corner. The later you dry them, the richer their dye will be. You tie them in a bundle of cloth and hang them above the hearth so the warmth carries away moisture without cooking them. You slice fresh haws into a pot with a few slices of wild apple from the storehouse. You add water and simmer until the fruit softens into a tangy compote. You ladle it into a bowl for tonight's supper. You know its tart flavor will complement the simple stew simmering in the next pot. Your children will marvel at its bright color. By dusk, your kitchen overflows with jars and bundles. Cordial of elder, sloe vinegar, bilberry preserve, rosehip tea, haw compote, dyed ivy berries. You admire your work and thank the hedgerows and the ancient power of wild fruit. You set a wooden bowl of haw compote on the supper table beside coarse bread and brothy stew. Your family gathers at the hearth and marvels at the bright tang of fruit that only nature could yield. As you eat, the last light of day fades through the window. You close your eyes against the shadows and let the berries' warmth settle in your belly. Each tangy spoonful carries the taste of wild fields, the labor of your hands, and the promise that even in winter's depths life endures. Tonight you sleep content, knowing that tomorrow you will repeat these rituals and draw strength from the humble bounty of foraged greens and berries alike. You rise before the sun to prepare the humble staples that will carry you through days when meat is but a memory. You fetch the small sacks of dried peas and beans from their spot beneath the eaves where they have sat since last harvest. Each sack feels heavy with promise and protein. The peas are round and pale green like worn sea glass, the beans plump and speckled in mottled browns and ivory. You carry the sacks to your work table beside the hearth where the morning light filters through a narrow window. You empty the first sack onto a coarse linen cloth spread across the table. The peas scatter like tiny pebbles. You sort through them carefully, discarding any that are shriveled, cracked, or discolored. Each imperfect pea You flick away into a basket for the fire pit. The good peas you scoop into a wooden bowl, patting them gently to settle their weight. You repeat the process with the beans, rolling each across the cloth with your thumb to test for hidden stones. You find a single flint and toss it aside. You finish sorting and feel the smooth heft of the remaining pulses in both bowls. With the sorted peas and beans before you, you fetch your clay-soaking vessel. It is a wide, shallow bowl, glazed on the inside to keep out moisture. You rinse it with cold water drawn fresh from the well. The water glides over your hands cool and clear. You carry the vessel to the wicker basket holding kindling and stir embers until they glow bright beneath the cooking pot. You set the clay bowl on a hot stone near the hearth so it warms slightly. This preheating will coax moisture into every pulse and reduce the risk of cracking. You return to the table and fetch a ladle of fresh water. You pour it over the sorted peas until they float and swirl in a gentle whirl. The water carries flecks of dust and stray husks away from the pulses. You lift a handful of peas from the bowl and rub them between your palms, feeling the rough texture. You inspect each pea for any remaining blemish before dropping it back into the water. You scoop out the murky liquid with a ladle and pour it into the fire pit. You repeat until the water runs clear, each rinse revealing the bright green of healthy peas. Next, you fill the clay bowl with fresh water again and add the sorted peas. You press them gently beneath the surface to encourage them to drink. You let the water rise a finger above the peas, knowing that each will swell to twice its size. You carry the bowl back to the hearth's edge and set it beside the simmering embers. The vessel hums with warmth, and the peas begin to plump even in the lukewarm air. You return to the beans. You fetch a second vessel and rinse the beans as you did the peas. You pour off the rinse water until the beans sit in cool clarity. You spoon out any damasked or broken beans and store them for a thin broth later. You add fresh water to cover the beans by a palm's width. Then you place the bowl next to the peas on the hearthstones. Both vessels exhale gentle steam that tints the air with the smell of soft earth and promise. While the pulses soak, you prepare your workspace for tomorrow's cooking. You kneel to sweep stray pulses from the floor, gathering them into a small pile that you will husk for livestock feed. You hang the linen cloth aside to dry near the smoke eave. You rinse your sorting cloth in cold water and wring it until it drips. You spread it over a low rail to catch the dawn breeze. You turn back to the hearth. The hearth's warmth coaxes tiny bubbles along the edges of both clay vessels. You stir the peas with a wooden spoon, hearing the soft slosh as grains move. You taste a single pea. It feels tender beneath your teeth but still holds a slight bite. Tomorrow this pea will cook into a soft mash or add substance to a pot of thin soup. You nod in satisfaction and stir the beans. A small whitish film floats on the surface. You skim it away. This film carries bitter oils, and removing it will help the beans digest more easily. You fetch a pinch of coarse salt and add it to each vessel. The salt crystals hiss as they meet warm water and sink to the bottoms. You stir again so every pea and bean tastes the faint tang of minerality. You cover each bowl with a cloth to keep out ash and insects. You tie the cloth with a strip of linen and turn your mind to the labors ahead. Your hands still smell of peas and beans. You wipe them on your apron and carry a fresh gourd of water to each vessel. You refill until the water rises above the pulses once more. You leave extra water beside the hearth so the soaking process will not run dry through the night. You know that constant moisture is key for even swelling and easier cooking. As the day unfolds, you tend other chores, the milking of the cow, the sweeping of the yard, the gathering of kindling for tomorrow's fire. Yet your mind returns to the soaking peas and beans. You imagine them plumping like swelling hearts beneath the surface. In the morning, you will drain them and set them to simmer with bits of smoked bacon if you are lucky. If no meat remains, then you will cook them with wilted greens and a handful of herbs. Either way, They will stretch the length of your meals and fill your body with the protein scarce in times of want. Before the sun dips low in the sky, you check the bowls once more. You lift the cloth covers and stir each vessel. The peas now brim near the top and feel as soft as small grapes. The beans have at least doubled in size and tease with the promise of creamy flesh when boiled. You set the cloth covers back and thank the hearth for its gentle heat. You know that tomorrow you will strain away the soaking water and rinse the pulses once more before cooking. As dusk settles, you pour the soaking water onto the garden beds. Its starchiness will settle the earth and feed your squash and herbs. You return your vessels to the hearthstones and stoke the embers to a quiet glow. You hang your apron and lay aside the wooden spoon. You gather the cloth covers and rinse them one last time before hanging them to dry. You stand in the amber light of the hearth and breathe deeply. The room feels suffused with warmth and faint sweetness of soaked pulses. You repeat a prayer of gratitude for the humble gifts of peas and beans, the labor of harvesting, and the alchemy of hearth and water. You step outside and let the cool night wind brush your face. Tonight, as you lay your head on straw and furs, you carry the thought of tomorrow's feast. You dream of bowls of creamy peas and beans set in savory broth. You dream of bread dipped into the cooking liquid and of the faint tang of herbs. You know that soaking pulses tonight will multiply sustenance tomorrow. In this simple ritual lies the strength of generations. You drift into sleep, wrapped in the quiet promise of legumes, beans, and pulses that will stretch protein when meat is scarce. You rise before dawn once more and carry the clay bowls of soaked peas and beans back to the hearth's edge. The night's coals still glow beneath the grate, faint embers cradled in ash. You stoke the fire gently with small kindling so that a steady warmth suffuses the hearthstones. You set the vessel of peas on one side and the vessel of beans on the other. You fetch a wooden ladle and slide it beneath the soaking peas. You pour the cloudy water into a waiting bowl. The liquid swirls and clouds the air as steam rises. You lift the bowl and pour the water outside onto the garden bed. The water is rich with starch, and you know it will settle the earth and bring a little nourishment to tomorrow's greens. You return the bowl inside and rinse it once more in fresh water. Next, you lift the beans and pour off their soaking liquid as well. You rinse the beans twice, letting cold water cascade through your fingers and carry away any bits of husk. Each bean feels plump now and quivers when you press it. You taste one and note its soft tooth and gentle sweetness. You know that cooked it will become buttery in your mouth and carry more substance than any bread alone. You fill each vessel now with fresh water drawn from the well. You add a handful of salt to the peas and a pinch to the beans. You stir each pot with the spoon carved from boxwood. It scrapes across the clay gently. You listen to the sluice of water as it flows around the grains. You stir the peas again and watch as the water picks up a faint green glow. You stir the beans and note how the water turns a pale cream. You nod approval and step back. You move to the larder and fetch a handful of dried onion skins and root bits. You drop them into the bean pot. You add a few crushed bayberries for aroma and a sprig of withered thyme. You tie the thyme with linen string so you can remove it later. You turn your attention to the pea pot. You scoop in a handful of chopped carrots from yesterday's harvest and a cluster of nettle leaves that you dried in the last warm weeks. You know the nettles will soften and lend a faint green bitter note that cuts the sweetness of peas. You pour a splash of cold milk into each pot. The milk is but a cupful saved from your morning milking. You stir it into the legumes, watching as the liquid swirls into creamy streams. You fetch a lid for the pea pot and prop it gently atop the rim. You cover the beans with a scrap of cloth to let steam escape slowly. You adjust the fire so both pots simmer in a gentle bubble. While the soups cook, you prepare thick slices of coarse bread. You fetch yesterday's dough that you patted flat and let rest by the hearth. You break off small rounds and dust them with meal. You press them into a hot pan over the embers. Each round sizzles, and you flip them when the underside gleams golden. You bake until the crust crackles beneath your fingers. The bread gives off the warm scent of grain and smoke. You return to the legumes. The peas now glow a soft jade, and the beans shine like pale pearls. You lean close and inhale the mingled aroma of sweet peas, earthy beans, and the bite of onion and nettle. You ladle a spoonful of pea soup into a wooden bowl. The broth carries a faint sweetness and the weight of soft pulses. You taste and let the thick liquid roll across your tongue. It warms your chest and settles into your belly with comforting heft. You ladle a second bowl and carry it to your eldest child. She lifts the bowl and takes her first sip slowly. Her eyes widen at the creamy mixture. You break a piece of fresh flatbread and hand it to her. She dips it into the soup and chews thoughtfully. You watch as her shoulders relax and a small smile touches her lips. You ladle bean soup next and fill another bowl. The broth is pale and fragrant with thyme and bay. You taste it and find it rich beneath its simple appearance. You break the flatbread into thick strips and soak them in the bean broth. The bread swells and softens, absorbing every drop. You scoop up a handful and taste the mingled textures. The beans crumble on your tongue, and the bread gives substance to the meal. Your neighbor arrives at the hut door, carrying a small jar of salted fish. He lifts the lid to reveal silver fillets cured by smoke. He offers you a piece, and you press it between your lips. The fish tastes briny and strong. You chop the fillet into small flakes and stir it into the bean pot. You taste a spoonful and note how the savory fish lifts the gentle sweetness of beans. You pour the salted fish broth into your wooden mug and take a slow sip. The liquid leaves a fine sheen on your lips. Across the hearth, your daughter stirs a pot of barley gruel. You taste it and nod. It feels light beneath the belly but carries enough grain to bind tomorrow's strength. You fetch a handful of ground nettle seeds from a jar and sprinkle them into the porridge. The seeds thicken the porridge like little pearls that burst with green bitterness. By mid-morning, the meals are ready. You carry bowls of pea soup and bean soup to your neighbors. Each family gathers at the hearth, passing bowls and flatbread in silent ritual. You watch as the heavy bowls lighten with every spoonful, and the bread vanishes between eager hands. When every bowl is empty, you sit in a circle and pass around the pot of barley porridge. You let each neighbor dip for a ladle, and then rest the handle on your palm. You understand that this common feast binds your kin more surely than any toast. Later, you drain the bean pot and carry a spoonful of solids to the garden. You feed the roots of your cabbage patch with the soft beans and scraps of onion. You scatter the last salted fish bones beneath the compost heap so future crops will taste of the sea's distant promise. By evening, both pots stand empty and the hearth glows once more. You rinse each clay bowl and hang them above the hearth to dry. You sweep stray crumbs and pulses from the floor and return the spoons to the larder hook. You gather the last flatbread and store it in a cloth beneath your bed. You cover it with linen to keep out mice. You stand by the hearth and watch the coals fade to grey. The scents of legumes and wild herbs linger in the air. Your belly feels full yet light. Your heart feels warm with community and daily ritual. You whisper a prayer of thanks for the simple gifts of peas and beans, for the alchemy of water, time and hearth. You step outside and let the cool night air brush your face. You gaze at the stars peeking through the thatch. You know that tomorrow you will repeat these humble labors and feed your family again from the roots of pulses and the warmth of fire. You return inside and lay down to rest, carrying the quiet promise that in every bowl of soaked and simmered legumes lies the strength to endure when meat is scarce and seasons turn from harvest to lean. You wake before first light and slip from your straw pallet, careful not to disturb the coals still glowing in the hearth. The air in the cottage feels damp and cold. You pull on your woolen tunic and cloak, Then step outside into the soft grey of dawn. Dew clings to every blade of grass, and the world seems hushed as if holding its breath for the sun's first ray. You carry a small wooden stool and a clay pail, its sides cool against your palm. You make your way down the narrow path toward the cowshed where the ox-eye lantern hangs by the door. Its wick burned low last night, yet still holds a faint ember that you coax into flame. You lift the lantern and push open the heavy door. The warmth of hay and the low hum of cow breath greet you. 8 cows stand in their stalls, their flanks wide and udders heavy. Each cow shifts its weight and stirs dust motes in the dim light. You approach the first cow, a brindled creature named Marigold who trusts you most of all. You rest your hand on her flank and speak softly. You thank her for the milk she offers. She hums in response and flicks her ear at a fly. You settle your stool on the ground and position the clay pail beneath her udder. You grasp her teat between thumb and finger and squeeze gently. A slender stream of pale milk arcs into the pail. You work carefully, alternating teats with steady rhythm. Each squeeze releases warm milk, and you listen to the soft patter as it gathers in the clay vessel. The early minutes pass in quiet meditation, broken only by cow breath and the distant cooing of doves. You finish the first cow and rise to move to the next stall, wiping your hands on your tunic before settling the pail beneath another udder. You work your way down the line until the clay pail stands nearly full. The milk smells sweet and fresh, carrying a faint, grassy scent from yesterday's pastures. You lift the pail and step from the cowshed into the open yard. The lantern's flame trembles in your grasp. You carry the milk to the cottage and set the pail beside the hearth. You fetch a larger cooking pot and pour the milk inside. Steam curls upward as the milk warms against the pot's sides. You set a small clay bowl beneath the spout of the pot, ready to catch the first run of whey. Nearby, you find a handful of rennet that you saved when the merchant last passed through, a small piece of dried sheep stomach lining. You cradle it in your palm and break it into fragments with your thumb. You return to the pot and stir the rennet fragments into the warm milk, careful to distribute them evenly. You cover the pot and leave it by the hearth embers. In the gentle warmth, curds will form as solids separate from the liquid. While the milk begins to curdle, you step outside to gather fresh herbs for flavor. You snip a few sprigs of mint and chamomile from your herb garden and tuck them into a cloth. The dawn sun warms the courtyard, and you breathe deep of earth and smoke. Soon you will strain the cheese and mix in herbs to preserve it longer. Inside the cottage, you find your daughter stirring a small bowl of barley porridge. She looks at you with bright eyes and asks if the cheese will be ready soon. You nod and smile, then return to the pot. You lift the lid and peek inside. The milk has thickened into curds, as white as new wool. Clear yellow whey pools around the curds. You fetch a slotted wooden spoon and begin to scoop the curds into a cloth-lined basket. Each scoop brings a handful of tender solids that drip with whey. When the basket is full, you lift it and hang it from a wooden hook beside the hearth so gravity can press out more whey. You twist the cloth's top into a knot and wrap it around a peg so the curds form a compact mass. In a few hours, you will shape it into rounds and salt it lightly to preserve the cheese through the week. You return to the pot of whey still warm on the hearthstones. You ladle the clear liquid into earthenware jugs. You fill each jug and seal it with linen cloth tied tight. You set the jugs in a cool corner of the larder. Tomorrow you will drink the whey, thin and tart, mixed with honey when you can spare the sweetness. The drink will soothe your belly and strengthen your bones. By mid-morning, the curds have drained into a solid mound. You lower the basket and place the curd mass on a board, dusted with coarse salt. You sprinkle more salt over the top, rubbing it gently into the surface. You shape the curd into 2 small loaves, pressing firm so they hold together. You tuck them back into the cloth and leave them to rest on a shelf, gravity still drawing moisture away. While the cheese drains further, you pour a small jug of fresh whey into a clay bowl and stir in a spoonful of wildflower honey traded at market last week. You taste it and feel the tang of whey balance with the sweetness of honey. You pass the bowl to your neighbor, who praises the cool drink. He thanks you and offers you a slug of warmed ale in return. You accept and savor the bitter warmth that flows through you. You wash your hands and return to the breakfast table. A simple meal of thin cheese on coarse bread awaits. You slice a piece of the newly formed cheese and place it between two thick slices of bread. The cheese's texture is crumbly, but holds enough moisture to moisten the bread. You bite and feel the mild tang of fresh curd balanced by the grainy loaf. You swallow slowly, letting the flavors settle before you take a second bite. Your children gather round and each receives a small piece of the cheese sandwich. They chew contentedly and hum approval. There is no sweeter delight than the taste of home's bounty made at dawn. You pour each child a cup of whey drink mixed with a drop of honey. They sip carefully, eyes closing in enjoyment. When the meal ends, you clear the table and sweep the floor. You rinse the cheese board and ladle leftover whey into the garden beds once more. The fields will drink these thin milky waters and release life in return. You hang the honey jars and cloth covers in the larder, then wipe your brow on your sleeve. As the sun climbs higher, you step outside to tend the cows. You peer into each stall and sweep away soiled straw. You replace it with fresh bedding from the loft. The cows shift and low in thanks, their soft breaths warming the air. You pat their flanks and speak gentle words. You thank them again for the milk that sustains your family. Later you return home and find the cheese loaves firmer against the cloth. You untie the knot and lift the cheese. You slice off a sliver and taste it. The salt has drawn out tangy notes, and the curds remain soft. You smile at the flavor and wrap the rest for tomorrow's breakfast. As dusk approaches, you stoke the hearth and set a pot of whey to heat with a handful of barley meal. You stir until the mixture thickens into a warm gruel. You ladle it into bowls and serve it to your family. They sip quietly, soothed by the creamy drink. Tonight they sleep full of cheese and whey, warm in their beds. You stand by the hearth, hands on your hips, and survey the room. The air still carries the smell of fresh milk and herbs. You whisper a prayer of thanks for the simple gifts of dairy. You know that tomorrow you will rise again before dawn and repeat this ritual of milking, curdling, draining, and drinking. But now you will rest, content in the knowledge that for this day your family has eaten its fill and drawn strength from the gentle labors of milking cows and gathering dairy. You slip into your worn leather boots before dawn and step onto the dew-damp field where rabbit trails weave through tall grass. You carry a simple snare made of twisted sinew and a small knife at your waist. The world is hushed, except for the distant call of an owl fading into the morning. You move quietly, scanning for faint footprints pressed into softened earth. When you find a narrow game path, you kneel and set the snare with practiced fingers. You hide the loop beneath a thin scattering of grass so that only a curious nose might disturb it. Then you rise and vanish into the half-light. Moments later, you reach the riverbank where water laps at your ankles. You unpack a net woven from fine twine and hold it aloft so the current cannot catch the mesh. You wade into the shallow eddy, feeling smooth stones shift beneath your feet. You lower the net into the water and angle its mouth against the gentle flow. You wait, arms steady, as the river whispers around you. Your breath comes slow and steady. A sudden tug pulses through the net. You lift it slowly and find a silver trout trembling inside the mesh. You cradle the fish in your hands and nod gratitude for its life. You rinse it in clear water and then return the net to its place. You scan the river's curve for signs of more fish, but find none stirring in the dim light. You fold the net and carry the trout back to shore. You set it on a flat stone and examine its gleaming scales, each reflecting morning's first pale rays. You draw your knife and slit the belly, removing the innards with swift strokes. You rinse the cavity and tie the fish by its tail to a length of rope. You return to your snares near the field edge. You pause beneath an ancient oak and check the first loop. You find a small rabbit caught by its hind foot. You lift the animal gently and whisper thanks. You use your knife to dispatch it swiftly, mindful of the respect owed to every life taken. You heft the limp body and empty the snare for reuse. You hide the loop and move to the next snare, hoping for another catch before the sun breaks. By sunrise, you have 6 rabbits and a trout. You shoulder your haul and make your way home along a narrow deer path that winds between hedgerows. Every so often, you pause to catch the scent of wild mint or to watch a flock of starlings wheel overhead. The air warms and the earth smells of spring and rain. You step lightly, knowing that each step takes you closer to preserving life for winter's lean times. At your smokehouse, you build a small fire of oak chips and dried herbs. You lay each rabbit on wooden hooks driven into the wall. You hang the trout beneath them so smoke can rise and curl around every haunch and scale. You feed the fire gentle gusts of air with a small bellows, coaxing smoke that smells of pine and sage. The smokehouse door remains ajar, so cool air mixes with the hot fumes and dries each carcass slowly without cooking it. You step back and admire the line of game swaying gently in the scented haze. You know that tomorrow they will bear the flavor of smoke and salt. You close the door and let the fire burn low. You gather a handful of embers to stoke the hearth and leave the rest to nurture the smokehouse through the night. Inside the cottage, you hang the beaten path snare and net beside your work table. You fetch a clay bowl and fill it with water. You dip each trap piece and rinse away dirt and blood. You hang them to dry in the low glow of the hearth. You wrap your hands around a wooden mug of whey mixed with honey. The cooling drink soothes your heart and warms your spirit after the morning's labor. You kneel by the hearth and carve a small plate from a slab of wood. You set 2 rabbits' legs on it and drizzle them with melted tallow from last season's cookings. You roast them slowly over the embers, turning frequently until the meat glistens with fat. You taste a small piece and feel the rich grease slide across your tongue, followed by the deep forest scent of smoke. You break off a piece of flatbread and dip it into the remaining tallow. You savor every crumb. By midday, the smokehouse has drawn enough smoke to cure the game. You open the door and lift each hook in turn. The rabbit's hides pull away easily from firm flesh. You skin them carefully, saving each pelt for winter's lining. You place the smoked meat on a board to cool and then wrap it in linen. You set the packages on a shelf beside your dry store. You gut and fillet the trout and salt its flesh before hanging it in the smokehouse as well. When evening settles, you light the hearth fire and wash the day's tools. You hang the net and snare beside the larder. You scoop the last of the whey drink into mugs and pass them to your family. Each child sips and smiles at the warming tang. You place a plate of smoked rabbit and trout on the table with fresh greens from last week's harvest. You eat together under the humble light of a single candle. You taste the sweetness of survival and the quiet pride of skill honed by need. Outside, the wind stirs branches and the night sky glows with distant stars. You finish your meal and clear the table. You carry the empty plates to the hearth and rinse them clean. You sweep the floor and hang your cloak by the door. Tonight you sleep soundly, wrapped in cold fur and the memory of dawnfields and river bends. You know that when hunger returns, you will lean on the smokehouse's bounty and the skill of your hands. In the cycle of trap net, smoke, and feast lies the promise that winter's long nights will not find you empty-handed. In the steady rhythm of fishing, hunting, and smoking lies the true art of survival. You step into the pale morning light and head to the smokehouse where yesterday's game still hangs in fragrant haze. Each rabbit and trout bears a thin film of salt and smoke. You reach for the first haunch and wrap it in a handful of coarse sea salt gathered from the shore months ago. You press the salt into every crevice of the meat, coating its surface in crystals that promise preservation. You repeat the process with each piece of meat, stacking salted cuts on a wooden plank beside a low-burning fire. The smokehouse's warmth draws moisture from the flesh and begins the alchemy of curing. With the meat salted, you move to the herb rack built above the hearth. Delicate bundles of thyme, sage, rosemary, and mint hang from wooden pegs, tied with strips of linen. You select a handful of fresh lavender and twist its stalks together. You add lavender to the rack and whisper thanks for its calming scent and antibacterial properties. Next, you gather chives and parsley from the pot by the window and hang them in generous bunches. You close your eyes as the herb's fragrance mingles with smoke and hearth warmth. Each herb you add will dry slowly, its aromas intensifying as moisture leaves. You turn to the root cellar beneath the cottage threshold. A stout wooden hatch seals the earth. You lift it and descend into cool dimness. Straw cushions the dirt floor in neat rows that mark the spots for storing root vegetables. You carry down baskets of carrots, turnips, and parsnips pulled fresh from the field's last harvest. Each root bears clinging soil that you brush away with a soft brush. You inspect each for bruises or soft spots, setting aside any that show decay for immediate cooking. You bend and place a layer of straw on the first row, then arrange carrots side by side. You cover them with another blanket of straw and press gently so no carrot touches another. The straw insulates and wicks away excess moisture. You repeat with turnips and parsnips until each row stands leveled beneath the earthen ceiling. You step back and admire the neat lattice of roots sleeping beneath the earth. Above you, a lantern swings softly on a hook. Its flicker casts the cellar in golden warmth. You ensure the hatch closes tightly to keep cold and damp at bay. You climb the steps and reseal the hatch. Now your roots rest in darkness, where they will remain crisp until spring thaw. Back in the cottage kitchen, you fetch a clay jar filled with salted herring cured last winter. You unscrew its clay lid and lift the first fish. You hold it close and inhale its briny tang. You place the herring in a shallow pan and pour off the preserving brine. You spoon fresh water over each fish, then set them in the smokehouse for a final drying. The smokehouse's soft heat will firm the flesh and add gentle flavor. You return to the larder and fetch a handful of dried apple rings you prepared in autumn. Their edges crackle as you pile them in a wooden bowl. You add a sprinkle of ground cinnamon and let the spice drift through the air. These rings will flavor porridge and wine through long evenings. On the table, you find a jar of honeycomb sealed in wax. You spoon out a thick dollop and stir it into melted fat to make a salve for winter's chapped skin. You scoop the blend into small pots and seal each with cloth lids. These jars will soften lips and hands when frost bites through gloves. Now you prepare the final step of preservation. You mix coarse salt with crushed juniper berries and a hint of dried thyme. You pour this fragrant cure into a shallow tray and roll each salted meat piece in the herb-salted mixture. You tuck the trays into the cold pantry where shutters admit only faint morning light. The salty air will draw out moisture and deepen flavors over weeks. You pause to catch your breath and pace the room. Every surface holds preserves. Walls bear herbs and garlic braids. Shelves support jars of jam pickles and salted fish. The pantry feels like a treasure trove built from Earth's bounty and your own hands. Outside, the wind whistles through bare branches. You step onto the porch and gaze across snow-dusted fields. Soon winter will press hard against your walls. Snow will pile high and days shorten to frozen hours. But in your pantry and cellar, you have prepared. Salt, smoke, straw, and earth have joined forces to keep hunger at bay. You return inside and lift a jug of whey soup simmering on the hearth. You ladle it into rough bowls and pass them around. The tangy broth tastes of curdled milk and salt. You dip a hunk of preserved bread into the steam and chew thoughtfully. Each spoonful carries the labor of preservation and the assurance of nourishment to come. By evening, you complete your ritual. You rake ashes from the hearth into an ashtray beside the door. You wipe counters with vinegar and water to ward off pests. You hang the final bundle of dried lavender near the chimney so its scent drifts through each room. You hang baskets of winter squash on wall hooks and tuck extra straw beneath every sill. Before you rest, you light a single candle in the pantry. You open the door and stare at the lined jars and bundles. Each jar holds pickles, peaches, and preserves. Each bundle holds herbs waiting to flavor soups and bread. Every sack of flour sits next to jars of honey and vinegar. The pantry glows in golden lamplight. You step back and close the door. The chill air at the threshold tells you that your work is done. For months ahead, you and your kin will draw from these stores. You whisper a prayer of thanks for salt and smoke, earth, and hearth. You return to your straw pallet and draw the quilt close. Outside, the night, wind rattles shutters. Snowflakes drift across the lantern's glow. Inside you, sleep content knowing that no winter storm can empty your pantry or cellar. You will wake each dawn to salted herring and smoked rabbit. You will sip herbal teas steeped from dried mint and thyme. You will bake bread from stored grain and serve broth drawn from preserved roots. In the hush of winter's heart, you will taste the sun-warmed fields and summer's herb gardens through the skillful art of preserving food for winter. You wake before first light to tend the small ale brewing house at the edge of your village. The air feels crisp on your skin as you push open the door, made of thick oak planks. Inside the low-timbered room, the scent of soaked grains and warm wood greets you. You carry a woven basket filled with sprouted barley malt and a wooden paddle for stirring. Today you will brew a small batch of ale and prepare a weaker beer for children and the infirm. You set the basket on a low bench and fetch a clay pot of water warmed last night by embers left in the hearth. You pour the water into a large wooden vat carved from sturdy oak. The vessel stands on 3 carved legs, and its interior bears rings of old foam from countless brews past. You lift handfuls of the pale malted barley and sprinkle them into the water. Each grain sinks and swells as you stir with the paddle in slow circles. You coax pale steam from the surface and let the sweet scent of malt rise to fill the room. Once the grains have soaked, you add fresh water drawn cold from the well. You stir again until the mixture resembles a thin porridge. This mashing process will convert the malt starches into sugars that will feed the yeast. You cover the vat with a cloth to keep warmth in and let the mash rest for an hour. During this time, you move to a side table where hops buds lay drying on linen. You select a small handful of dried hops, their green cones brittle beneath your fingers. You break them open and inhale their pine-like aroma. Soon you will add these to the brew to lend bitterness and aroma. While the mash works, you fetch a small woven basket of yeast preserved from last season's brew. The yeast lives in a clay jug sealed with wax. You lift the wax seal and dip a finger to taste the yeasty tang. You nod approval and close the jug. You know that without this living culture, the sugars will never ferment into lively bubbles and alcohol. You return to the mash vat and lift the cloth. Steam drifts upward in pale curls. You tilt the paddle and watch as the thick mash undulates beneath your hand. You pass the paddle around the vat 3 times to ensure every grain rests in warmed water. Then you scoop a ladleful of mash and pour it through a coarse sieve into another pot. The sweet liquid that drips through tastes of barley and honey. This sweet wort will become the ale. You pour it back into the mash vat and stir again to combine. After the hour of rest, you fetch a linen straining bag. You tie its mouth to a branch laid across the vat's rim. You ladle the mash into the bag and let gravity pull the sweet wort into a second wooden vat beneath. You bump the bag gently to coax more liquid from the soaked grains. The spent grains you save to feed livestock or to make a thin porridge for breakfast. You lift the straining bag and let the last drips fall before tying it closed and setting it aside. Now the sweet wort fills the second vat. You lift a handful of hops and drop them into the boiling pot you built from clay on the hearth. You pour the wort into this pot and set a gentle fire below. You let the wort come to a slow rolling boil. You watch as steam rises thick and white. You skim off any foam that collects on the surface with a wooden ladle. When the wort simmers, you add the remaining hops. You stir once and let the bitterness steep. After 30 minutes of gentle boil, you lift the pot from the fire and pour the wort into a clean barrel made of ash wood. You let the barrel stand until the wort cools to a lukewarm heat. Using a long paddle, you stir the cooled liquid to release any heat trapped at the bottom. You fetch the yeast jug and pour the yeast into the barrel. You close the lid with a wooden bung and fit an earthenware airlock to let gas escape but keep air out. You move the barrel to a corner of the brew room where the air remains cool but free of drafts. Over the next days, the yeast will feast on the sugars and produce light foam and gentle bubbles of carbon dioxide. With the ale vatted, you turn to the weak beer meant for children and those who cannot bear strong drink. You fetch a small kettle of water and heat it over the hearth. You stir in a handful of the spent grains from the mash. You let them steep until the water darkens and smells of toasted barley. You strain the grains out and sweeten the liquid with a spoonful of honey. You add a pinch of hops for flavor, yet not enough to cause bitterness. You cool the brew, then pour it into small jugs. You draw a handful of nettle leaves and crush them before adding them to the jugs. The nettles lend a hint of green to the brew and a faint mineral tang. You seal each jug with cloth and set them upon a shelf where the mild brew will ferment gently for a day. You plan to give these jugs to mothers whose babies cannot nurse or to the elderly whose digestion demands gentle fare. You step outside into the brisk morning air to fetch fresh water for topping off both barrels. You pour water into each until the liquid just covers the yeasty foam. You seal the bungholes and wipe away drips. You tidy the brew room, stacking empty barrels and wiping every surface with a cloth steeped in vinegar. You hang the paddle on a hook and return the linen straining bag to its place. You return to the cottage and gather around the hearth with your family. You fetch a wooden bowl and pour a ladleful of last week's ale. You pass the bowl around and each takes a sip. The liquid tastes of summer sun warmed grain with a hint of hops bitterness and a gentle sparkle of bubbles. You feel the warmth spread from your belly and ease the chill of the early hour. Next, you serve the weak beer with nettle. You pour a small cup for the children. They sip and giggle at the earthy tang and the faint sweetness. Their eyes shine as the gentle brew warms their bellies. You drink alongside them from a shared mug. The nettle twist in the brew reminds you of spring pastures and green fields. You smile at your children and know that they drink safely without risk of overindulgence. Later, as the sun climbs higher, you check the fermentation barrels. You lift the airlock lids carefully and see the yeast foam beneath. You taste a small spoonful of ale directly from the barrel. It has lost much of its raw sweetness and carries a pale haze of bubbles. You nod and reseal the airlocks. You fetch a small portion in a bowl and blend it with honey and mint to make a morning tonic. You pass it to your neighbor who stands by to help with harvest. He sips and closes his eyes against the mellow bite of early ale. By evening, you return to tap the weak beer jugs. You lift each cloth cover and sniff the faint green aroma of nettle. You pour the beer into wooden mugs and pass them around a small table. You and your family toast to health and safe hydration. The children sip lightly. The elderly smile at the memory of stronger brews. You know that water alone can carry disease, but this fermented drink, cleansed by boil and tang from yeast, lets every drop nourish without fear. When the meal ends, you pour the last of the weak beer into the stew pot. You stir and let the liquid soak into chunks of root vegetable and bits of meat. You cover the pot and let it simmer overnight. Tomorrow your family will eat a rich stew spiced by barley and hops that nourishes bone and soul alike. You step outside beneath a sky simmering with dusk colors. You breathe deep and taste the day's labors. In the cycle of sprouting malt water, mash fermentation, and slow boil, you have turned humble grains into life-giving drink. In the art of weak beer, you have stretched sweetness and safety to young and old. In the craft of ale, you have captured summer's warmth for long winter nights. You close the cottage door and settle onto your straw pallet. You draw the quilt close and let the last taste of ale linger on your tongue. You whisper thanks for water turned sweet by yeast and warmth drawn from hearth and grain. Soon you will drift into sleep. Tomorrow you will tend the barrels again. You will watch for new bubbles rising through the airlock. You will bless the brew and share it once more. And in that steady flow of pale, ale and weak beer, you will carry your kin through days of thirst and nights of cold, until the sun returns once more to golden harvest fields. You wake to the sound of church bells carrying across the frost-dusted rooftops. They ring longer and louder than usual. That alone tells you today is different. Not a market day, not a funeral, but a feast day. One of the few scattered through the long calendar where joy is permitted. More than permitted, it is expected. You sit up from your straw pallet and wrap your wool cloak tighter around your shoulders. The cold air smells of wood smoke and barley porridge. You rise without the usual ache in your knees. The hunger in your belly feels less like burden and more like promise. Today, the table will not groan with abundance, but it will carry more than broth and hard bread. Today you will eat like your labor means something. The air outside is hushed but charged. You walk through the village and see others already at work. Neighbors sweep their thresholds with extra care. Children carry buckets to the well and return with water sloshing over the rims. A woman ties a sprig of rosemary to her door. Even the smoke from the bakehouse curls a little taller, a little prouder. Inside your hut, you set out your best cooking pot. It is no different than yesterday, but today you clean it more carefully. You scrub it with ash and water until it feels smooth under your fingers. Then you walk to the neighbor who promised to share a joint of salted pork. You trade him a small cloth of dried peas and a jar of sour berry preserve. You wrap the meat in clean linen and carry it home like treasure. You build a fire and lower the pork into boiling water with a few carrots from your cellar. You slice the last of your onions and stir them into the bubbling pot. Steam rises and fills the hut with the scent of rich fat and sweet root. You close your eyes and stand over the pot for a while. It smells like victory. It smells like survival. Next, you mix flour with honey and a splash of ale to form a soft dough. You roll it into little rounds and press dried fruit into their centers. You place them on a hot stone near the hearth and watch them blister. The smell pulls your children close. They sit cross-legged, eyes wide, hands in laps. You hand each one a warm cake and watch them bite with slow delight. For them, this is the peak of the season. By midday, the feast begins, not with trumpets or platters, but with bowls passed from hand to hand. Your family gathers around the hearth and dips coarse bread into thick stew. They chew slowly. They savor. You eat your portion with both gratitude and greed. The pork falls apart on your tongue. The fat glazes your lips. You wipe your mouth with the back of your sleeve and keep going. You do not speak. No one does. On a feast day, silence is reverence. Outside, neighbors call to one another and swap bowls of stew. You trade your honey cakes for a slice of spiced turnip pie and a mug of warm cider. You sip the cider and feel its heat travel to your fingertips. A child offers you a roasted apple, its skin split and steaming. You take it with a nod and eat it whole. As the sun dips behind the hills, songs rise from every corner. A drum made from old hide keeps time while voices chant verses older than memory. A boy claps out of rhythm and his mother laughs. You sit on a stool near the fire and watch the flicker of joy play across tired faces. For one day, hunger retreats. For one day, the work of survival makes room for celebration. But then, the fast begins. You wake the next morning and the bells sound different. Slower, lower. A reminder that you now enter a period of fasting. The church commands it, and your stomach will obey. No meat, no eggs, no dairy. Only broth, only dry bread, only discipline. The joy of the feast fades like candlelight. You pull your tunic tighter around your ribs and ladle thin soup into a wooden bowl. It is a broth of cabbage, leaves, and water. No salt, no herbs. You swallow it with effort. It fills the space in your belly, but offers no comfort. Your children eat without complaint. They have learned not to expect. Days pass in silence. Each morning begins with prayer. You kneel by the hearth and ask for strength. You ask for patience. You ask that the hunger remain quiet enough for you to keep your temper. In the fields, your steps grow slower. Your back bends sooner. You chew bread until your jaw aches. You drink water and try not to think about honey. Some days, you find a small joy, a clove of garlic, left at the bottom of a jar, a scrap of dried fruit hidden behind a basket. You divide it into as many pieces as there are mouths. You do not speak as you eat, you simply nod. A kind of quiet gratitude replaces conversation. On Sundays, the priest reminds everyone that fasting is holy, that suffering brings clarity. You believe him when the hunger stops hurting and becomes a kind of hum. You feel your bones more clearly. You hear your heartbeat louder in your ears. You do not dream of feasts anymore. You dream of work, of harvest, of bread that does not crumble. Then the vigil comes. You light a tallow candle and place it beside the hearth. The candle flickers as you kneel and bow your head. Your body is tired, but your mind is sharp. You feel each rib as you breathe. You hold the prayer in your mouth before letting it go. You ask for rain. You ask for strength. You ask for peace. You ask for just one more feast. And when it comes again weeks later, you eat like someone who remembers the ache of not eating. You bite into meat with reverence. You chew slowly, letting each flavor bloom like spring after frost. You pass food to your children and watch their eyes light up. The songs return, the smiles stretch wider. The fire burns brighter. This is the cycle, the feast and the fast, the plenty and the lack, the joy and the discipline. And through it all, you endure, you rise, you labor. You give thanks for every spoonful, whether rich or plain. You live in rhythm with the seasons and the saints, with the church and the hunger, with the land and the fire. You fall asleep on feast nights with a full belly and a full heart. You fall asleep on fasting nights with nothing in your gut but the quiet knowledge that you will wake again, ready to do it all once more. Scurvy rickets and the aches of a diet that barely filled a belly. You wake before light, but your body does not want to rise. Your legs feel heavy. Your back groans before you even reach for your tunic. You sit up slowly and blink into the cold stillness of the hut. Your breath clouds the air. The straw beneath you prickles your skin, but it is not the straw that makes you ache. It is the food, or rather, the lack of it. You roll your shoulders and feel the telltale pull behind your knees. Your joints do not glide the way they once did. They creak and catch like the hinges of an old barn door. Your bones feel hollow, not just tired but brittle. You press your thumb to your shin and see the skin stay sunken, slow to rise. You've seen this before in others. You know what it means. The hunger has moved from belly to blood. You shuffle across the packed dirt floor and stir the fire back to life. The coals are reluctant. You coax them anyway. You fetch the pot, pour in a thin gruel of barley and water, and set it to heat. You stare at the surface until steam begins to rise. You know this meal will do little. It will warm your insides. It will pass the time between now and midday, but it will not bring strength. Your daughter stirs from her mat. She sits up and stretches her thin arms. You notice the pale blotches on her cheeks, the way her gums bleed slightly when she coughs. You tell her not to lick her lips. The salt will only dry them more. She nods without argument. She has learned the quiet pain of empty nutrition. She moves slower now, not from laziness, but from lack. You sit together and sip the gruel in silence. There is no flavor, no fat, no green. You remember what it used to feel like to chew, to feel your teeth work against resistance. Now the food slides down like rainwater and leaves nothing behind. You glance at your hands and notice how thin the skin has become. You press a finger to your palm and count the seconds it takes for color to return. Too long. Later you visit the field. The soil resists your hoe more than usual, or maybe your arms are weaker. The furrows come slow. Your hands blister easily. The sun offers no comfort. It simply reveals your hollows. A neighbor passes by, and you notice the way his knees bow outward as he walks. You know the look. You have seen it in the children, in the old ones. The bones bend because they are soft, because the sun alone cannot make up for a diet without flesh or green. Your friend once called it the bowed curse. The legs curve, the spine follows, and then the lungs begin to struggle. You do not know the name for it, but you know its toll. You have buried children who could not stand straight. You have buried mothers who could not rise from bed. You dig and hoe and hope your body will carry you a little longer. You return home and find your youngest curled on the hearthstones, rubbing her legs. She says they ache when she walks. You press your hands to her shins and feel the softness where bone should hold firm. You mix a cup of whey with a pinch of salt and pass it to her. It is all you can offer. She drinks without protest and leans into your side. You wrap an arm around her and try not to imagine what the ache will become. The next morning you wake with a sore in your mouth. It stings when you sip water. You open your lips and run your tongue along your gums. The skin peels in places. A dark red spot blooms beside your back tooth. Your breath carries the sour scent of decay. You rinse with water and hope it passes, but you know it won't. You've seen it before. The teeth loosen, the gums rot, the breath smells of sickness, and before long, the bleeding starts. Not just from the mouth, but from the nose, the joints, the skin. You think of old seafarers and stories of long voyages where men died with swollen limbs and blackened gums, but you are no sailor. You are a peasant who has not tasted fresh fruit in a season, and whose stew has gone without green for too many weeks. You tell yourself the winter was hard, the stores are low, the roots have shriveled in the cellar, the herbs dried to dust. You will eat better when spring comes. You will boil fresh nettles. You will crush garlic into your porridge. You will find strength again, but spring feels far, and your fingers tremble more than they used to. You kneel in the field and feel the pulse in your head throb like a hammer. You stand too fast and the world spins. You brace yourself against the fence post and breathe slowly. You clench your jaw, but the soreness in your gums returns like a warning. You spit into the dirt and see a streak of red. You wipe your lips and return to work. That evening, you light a small candle and sit beside the hearth. You hold your youngest close and rub her legs. Her skin is cool. Her eyes are tired. You tell her stories from before the lean times. You tell her about feast days with meat and honey, about herb soup so green it stained your lips. She listens with wide eyes and a faint smile. She has never known such meals, but your words offer a kind of nourishment that food cannot. You eat a bowl of broth made from bones, long boiled dry. You chew on the gristle and imagine it giving strength to your own joints. You rub ash into your swollen gums and pray it dulls the pain. You whisper to the fire for warmth. not just for heat, but for something to burn the ache from your bones. You watch your neighbors age faster than they should. Their faces grow hollow, their steps shorten. Children lose their baby fat too early. Wrinkles deepen on young skin. The hunger is no longer about food. It is in the bones, in the blood, in the way fingers shake and knees refuse to bend. It is in the way eyes glaze over after a small meal and sleep feels heavier than rest. You know some will not see the harvest, not because of plague or war, but because their bodies could not stretch grain into strength. You know you might be one of them. You lie awake at night and feel the stiffness in your spine. You press your fingers to your chest and count the spaces between your ribs. You trace the ache in your hip and wonder how much longer your knees will hold. And still, you rise each morning. You boil the barley. You stir the gruel. You scrape the pot clean. You whisper prayers into your bowl. You eat what you can and offer the rest to those who need it more. You hold your children close and tell them that strength will return with the sun. You believe it, even if your joints say otherwise. Tomorrow you will rise again. You will walk to the field. You will lift the hoe. You will sip your broth and chew your bread. And you will endure, as peasants have always endured, beneath a sky that does not weep for the aches of a diet that barely fills a belly. Why your modern appetite and health would crumble under the weight of hunger and hard labor. You wake before dawn and feel your modern muscles ache with anticipation of steady comfort and rest. You stretch in your bed and recall how yesterday you walked without effort, carried groceries without strain, and shrugged off fatigue with a cup of coffee. Now you rise to a world without conveniences. You slip on coarse wool and step into straw, so cold it steals warmth from your toes. In that moment, you know you would not last a day where every hour demands bending, lifting, hauling, and kneading without pause. You walk outside and inhale the sharp scent of earth and smoke. No humid air of an office with filtered vents greets you. Instead, you taste the night's chill and feel the damp press against your lungs. You steady yourself against the rough wood of the doorframe and steel your spine. Modern comfort has trained your body to crave pillows soft as clouds and climate warmed at will. Here you face a wind that pierces cloak and skin alike. You shiver and remind yourself that cold is only the start of what you cannot endure. You step into the yard and see the plough waiting under a layer of frost. You have never guided an ox before. You have never wrestled leather reins and struggled against a beast to carve lines in heavy soil. You recall how you planted seeds in raised beds last spring with ease, using spade and wheelbarrow. Today you must bend and balance, learning to read the ox's gait and judge the soil's hunger. Each furrow you turn tests your arms. Each step you take sinks in mud or freezes in hard clay. You would not last an hour before you collapse under the weight of your own untested strength. You move to the barn to milk a cow. You have never knelt beside an udder before. The animal's low breath and the smell of hay invade your senses. You crouch on a wooden stool that offers no back or cushion. You grasp the teats and squeeze with precise rhythm or risk bruising the milk or the udder. Your modern palms, unused to rough work, smart and blister in minutes. You feel the strain in your wrists and shoulders. You think of electric pumps you once read about online. They seem like miracles here. You realize you would not last the day trying to coax milk by hand alone. Next, you tend to a small flock of chickens. You chase them across the coop, gathering eggs from nests. Your heart pounds not from exercise, but from sudden fear as wild chicks flutter toward your legs. You try to remember how to hold a fowl so you do not bruise the eggs or cut your skin on spiky feathers. You collect a dozen fragile shells and carry them back to the kitchen with trembling arms. You imagine cracking one gently at home in a neat bowl on a counter. Here you rinse it in cold spring water with numb fingers and hope it does not shatter. You enter the kitchen and see a pot of barley gruel simmering on the hearth. You have never made your own breakfasts beyond oatmeal and coffee. This pale, slurry smells of earth and old ash. You dip a wooden spoon and bring the gruel to your lips. It slides down as thin as rain and leaves no taste but hunger. You gulp water to wash it down and feel hollow yet oddly full of regret. In your world you choose lattes, smoothies, pastries. Here you would gorge and still starve. You step outside again and join the villagers hauling water from the well. You lower a heavy bucket into the stone shaft. You tug the rope up and spill droplets over your cloak. You carry 2 buckets at once on a yoke across your shoulders. Your back arches under the weight. You try to adjust as you once did with a heavy backpack on your morning run. The strain bites your shoulder blades and your legs wobble. You tear a cloth from your tunic to bind the yoke, but the pain deepens with each step. You would not last half a mile before you drop the buckets and collapse. You return to the field at midday and join a neighbor gathering turnips. You try to pry the root from the ground with fingers that have never dug deeper than a garden bed. You yank and strain until your fingernails bruise. You stand, turn the vegetable in your palm, and toss it into a basket. You taste a slice raw. The bitterness sears your tongue. You recall kale chips you once roasted in an oven with olive oil and salt. You shiver as you chew this raw peel. You would not last a moment, living off root vegetables alone. You walk toward the smokehouse where fresh meat hangs from wooden beams. You have never butchered an animal. The sight makes your stomach churn, yet your mouth water. You imagine gas ovens and butcher counters. Here you must skin, clean, cut precisely with a single blade. You imagine the smell of raw blood and you feel faint. You grip the handle of a slotted knife and force yourself to hang a pheasant by the head. You try to saw through bone without power tools. The blade catches in sinew. Your hand slips, and you nearly slice your palm. You step back, breathe deep, and taste iron on your tongue. You would not last a day armed only with primitive tools. You recall your modern diet of protein shakes, vitamins in pill form, fresh fruit whenever you please. Here no oranges, no citrus to fight scurvy, no cod liver oil for vitamin D, no stores of supplements. You think of sailors lost at sea, their gums bleeding and limbs swollen. You feel your own tendons tighten from lack of nutrients. You rub your arms and feel phantom aches. You realize your body would not survive a single month without modern medicine. You gather at dusk for a final task. The woodpile needs splitting. You swing an axe that has no sharpened edge. The chunk of oak resists. You raise the tool overhead and bring it down. Your arms sing with pain. The wood cracks, but barely. You hack again and again until dusk bleeds to night. Your arms tremble, and sweat drips down your back. You set the axe down and collapse against a tree. Your modern self would never suffer such strain without complaint, without a night of pain and a morning of agony. You would cry out for rest and comfort. Here you endure, or you perish. As night falls, you return to your hut and trace aches along your limbs. Each joint hums with new pain. Your muscles twitch, and your back curves in sorrow. You stare at a ragged quilt and try to imagine it as a mattress. You need strength to rise again at dawn. You need food you cannot provide. You need warmth you do not have. You would not last one day living this life. You kneel by your pallet and press hands together in silent prayer. You thank the convenience of your world, even if you took it for granted. You remember the ease of modern shoes, the comfort of heated rooms, of running water and plentiful food. You vow never to complain at breakfast, never to grumble at a long commute, never to yawn at a full schedule. You will honor what you have. You lie down on the straw and feel every ache as you drift towards sleep. You know that in the morning it will begin again. You will wake before dawn and face the world with hands raw and heart racing. You will bite the barley gruel and sip tepid water. You will split wood, haul water, plow fields and milk beasts. And you will endure, or you will not last at all. In that moment you understand the truth. A modern appetite and fragile health would crumble under the weight of hunger and labor. You would not survive a single day as a medieval peasant.